The cold steel of the restraints bit into Lieutenant Samuel Hudson's wrists, but he barely noticed. The pain was a distant thing, something to be acknowledged but ignored. What mattered was the room, the layout, the breathing of the creatures. Standing before him, the way their slit-pupiled eyes gleamed in the eerie blue glow of the interrogation chamber. He sat in the center of the circular room, bound to a chair that seemed almost ceremonial, its design more for display than function. His boots had been removed, his weapons stripped, yet he sat as if he were still armed, his presence filling the space despite the obvious disadvantage. The Selvari loomed around him, their scaled hides shifting in hues of green and gold, betraying their unease. These creatures, conquerors of a dozen worlds, stood inches taller than any human, their elongated skulls crowned with ridges of calcified bone. Their leader, a Selvari of formidable stature, stepped forward, his dark robes embroidered with symbols that shimmered like liquid metal. Overseer Vorkar. "You are the first human prisoner of the Selvari Empire," Vorkar said, his voice a deep, vibrating growl. "It is an honor you will not survive." Samuel tilted his head slightly, studying the alien's face. The Selvari were a proud species, meticulous in their hierarchy. This one held power, but not absolute control. That meant there were others to impress, expectations to meet. It also meant ego, an exploitable weakness. "I'm touched," he said, his voice dry, devoid of fear. Vorkar's eyes narrowed, his lipless mouth pulling back to reveal jagged teeth. "Your kind is fragile, weak. You will tell us what we wish. To know before your body fails." Samuel let out a slow breath. He knew what was coming: pain, psychological manipulation. They would try to break him, to strip him down to something lesser, something compliant. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Vorkar turned, gesturing with two clawed fingers. A second Selvari stepped forward, smaller but no less imposing. This one carried a device in its hand, a crystalline apparatus that pulsed with a dull violet light. Samuel recognized the shape, the purpose. A psionic inducer. They weren't just going to hurt him, they were going to invade him. The Selvari's psionics were the backbone of their empire. They didn't just wield weapons, they wielded minds. Thought flayers, dream eaters, human soldiers had many names for them. With enough focus, they could sift through memories, unearth secrets, tear apart the mental defenses of lesser beings. Samuel wasn't lesser. The device flared to life, a searing wave of force slamming into his skull. For a moment, it was as if his mind had been set ablaze, his neurons screaming. It wasn't just pain, it was pressure, a violation, a presence trying to force its way into places it didn't belong. He grit his teeth, locked his muscles. Not against the pain, against the urge to lash out. He had to wait. Vorkar watched him, eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "Your mind is strong, impressive, but it will not hold." The psionic pressure grew sharper, probing, searching for entry points. Samuel breathed through it, the way he had been trained. He had been through worse. In the cold corridors of Earth's Black Ops training programs, they had broken men harder than this. His mind was not a vault, not a wall to be battered down, but a maze. He twisted his own thoughts, throwing up false memories, fabrications, decoys. The Selvari interrogator faltered. Confusion flickered across his face. Samuel pressed deeper into his own thoughts, willing the invader to see what he wanted him to see. A childhood in a broken city, a life of poverty and hardship. Nothing strategic, nothing real. The device flickered. The Selvari staggered back, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. Samuel exhaled slowly. "That the best you got?" A growl rippled through the assembled Selvari. Vorkar stepped forward, seizing the psionic device and studying it as if it had betrayed him. "You resist," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Curious, Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The game was shifting. They thought they had captured prey. They were realizing they had caged something else entirely. Vorkar exhaled sharply through his nostrils and tossed the device aside. The action was small, but it spoke volumes. The overseer didn't like things he couldn't control. That meant the real interrogation was about to begin. He leaned down so close that Samuel could see the fine ridges along his reptilian skin. "What is your name?" Samuel's lips curled slightly. "John." The overseer struck him. A sharp, open-palmed blow that snapped his head to the side. Pain flared across his jaw, but he didn't react. He had felt worse. Vorkar's expression darkened. "Your rank." Samuel met his gaze, eyes cold. "Janitor." Another strike. "Harder this." "Time." Vorkar exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. "You waste your breath on defiance, human. We already know who you are." A flick of his wrist. One of the lesser Selvari handed him a data slate. Vorkar studied it for a moment, his eyes flicking over information. Samuel couldn't see the text, but he recognized the tension that suddenly ran through the overseer's frame. A pause, then a glance. A slow, wary glance at Samuel. Vorkar's grip on the slate tightened. His eyes flicked to the other Selvari in the room. He lowered the device slightly, as if reluctant to say what was on it aloud. Then he turned back, his voice quieter. "Wait." A hesitation. Then the words fell like stones. "Your callsign?" "The Grim Reaper?" Samuel said nothing. He didn't need to. The chamber shifted. The air felt different. One of the other Selvari, standing near the back, took a step away from him. Vorkar's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the edge of the data slate like a man holding something suddenly radioactive. He knew they all did. The Grim Reaper saw the calculations flickering through their minds. The Selvari were warriors, conquerors, but they believed in legends, in warriors whose names carried weight. The human before them was no ordinary soldier. He was something else, something that had been whispered through their ranks, dismissed as propaganda. A phantom in the dark that killed without mercy, without sound, without warning. Samuel leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed, his voice a whisper. "You just realized your mistake, didn't you?" Vorkar did not answer. His silence was answer enough. Samuel could see it now, the way their postures shifted, the flickers of doubt, of unease. They had captured him, thinking they had won a prize. But now they were wondering if they had locked themselves in. Here with something far worse. One of the younger Selvari swallowed audibly. "Overseer, perhaps we should—" Vorkar silenced him with a look, but Samuel saw what lay beneath it. Fear. His lips parted just slightly as he let the moment sink in. Then he spoke. "Whatever you thought this was." His voice was quiet, even. Deadly. "I have no idea what's coming." The chamber, filled with conquerors of worlds, was silent. And then, from somewhere deep in the ship, an alarm began to blare. The silence in the interrogation chamber was thick, almost suffocating. Vorkar held the data slate tightly, his claws digging into its surface. The weight of realization had settled over him, pressing into his chest like a vice. The name on the screen, the call sign that carried a reputation whispered in the darkness of Selvari war councils, was not supposed to be real. And yet here he was, sitting before them, bound but unbroken. The younger officers exchanged uneasy glances. It was a rare thing to see hesitation in the eyes of Selvari warriors, creatures bred for war, trained in the art of domination. Yet, the Grim Reaper's presence was a fracture in their certainty, a slow crack forming in the ironclad belief that humanity was nothing more than another species to be conquered. Vorkar turned to his second-in-command, Zeltan, whose usually expressionless face had grown unnervingly still. Zeltan was a strategist, a tactician who had studied every recorded battle against humanity, and now his mind worked furiously, piecing together fragmented reports, classified documents, half-believed rumors. The legend had always been dismissed. A ghost of war, a fabrication meant to strike fear into the Empire's soldiers. No single human could do the things the Grim Reaper had been credited with. The sabotage of the Harzok fleet yards, the massacre at Vale Prime, where an entire Selvari outpost had been silently wiped out in one night. The rumors claimed it was the work of a single operative, a man who never left survivors, a shadow that only appeared when death was certain. And now that shadow sat before them, waiting. Vorkar clenched his jaw. "Our name means nothing," he growled, as if saying it aloud would force his subordinates to believe it. A human is still a human. No one responded. The Grim Reaper sat still, watching, his expression unreadable. He could feel the shift, the subtle change in the air. They had expected a nameless prisoner. Instead, they had caged the monster from their war stories. Finally, Zeltan exhaled, his gaze locked onto Samuel as if trying to reconcile the myths with the man before him. "Perhaps we should reconsider our approach," he said carefully. "If this is truly the Grim Reaper, interrogation may not be the best course of action." Vorkar turned on him sharply. "Are you suggesting we release him?" His tone was incredulous, laced with barely restrained rage. "No, Zeltan," said voice steady. "I am suggesting that we do not underestimate him." Samuel chuckled softly, a dry sound that made some of the younger Selvari flinch. They were afraid. He could see it, taste it in the air. The moment his call sign had been uttered, the balance of power had shifted, even if they refused to admit it. He leaned forward slightly, the movement small but deliberate. "You still don't get it, do you?" His voice was calm, measured. "You think you have the advantage? You think I'm your captive? But the second you saw that name, you lost control of this situation." Vorkar's claws twitched, his temper simmering beneath his rigid composure. "We hold you in chains, human. Do not mistake fear for prudence." Samuel met his gaze without blinking. "I don't need you to be afraid," he said simply. "I just need you to hesitate." Vorkar snarled, but the truth had already seeped into the room like a toxin. Samuel could see the doubt spreading, a slow infection crawling through their rigid command structure. Selvari forces were ruthless, disciplined, but they thrived on certainty, on the absolute belief that they were superior. Doubt was poison to them. Zeltan shifted, his fingers tapping against the panel of his wrist-mounted communicator. "Sir," he said carefully, "perhaps we should consult the War Council. If this truly is the Grim Reaper, there may be alternatives." Vorkar's gaze snapped to him. "There will be no alternatives." His voice was sharp, but even he knew that command was slipping through his fingers. He turned back to Samuel, eyes narrowing. "You are nothing more than a soldier, a man in chains. Whatever games you play will not save you." Samuel tilted his head slightly. "You keep telling yourself that?" The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with unspoken words. The younger officers refused to meet his gaze now, and Samuel knew why. He had seen it before in other battles on other worlds, the slow, creeping realization that they were no longer the hunters. Zeltan exhaled, his tone careful, measured. "There is another problem, Overseer." Vorkar turned sharply. "Speak." "The fleet." Zeltan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They have received word that we have taken a human prisoner, and that his designation is the Grim Reaper." Vorkar's expression darkened. Samuel watched them, his heartbeat steady. The pieces were falling into place. Zeltan continued, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "The reports have spread further than intended. It seems several fleet commanders have voiced concern." Samuel didn't need to ask why. The Selvari had made an unthinkable mistake. They hadn't just captured a human. They had captured a myth. Whispers would be spreading now, beyond this ship, beyond this fleet. Every soldier who had ever heard the name, the Grim Reaper. Every officer who had dismissed the stories, but felt that lingering doubt. It would all start chipping away at their certainty. Vorkar's claws flexed, his composure fraying at the edges. "The fleet does not dictate my command, but perception does," Zeltan said quietly. "And if the wrong people start believing the stories, if enough of them think we are in danger, they will act accordingly." Samuel smiled, slow and deliberate. "You're realizing it now, aren't you?" Vorkar turned sharply, rage simmering just beneath the surface. Samuel continued, voice calm as ever. "You don't just have to deal with me. You have to deal with what they believe about me. You have to deal with the fact that your own people, your own warriors, might start wondering if you've made a mistake." The chamber was silent. The A. Words had landed, heavy as a death sentence. Vorkar's breath was steady, controlled, but his fists clenched tightly at his sides. You think fear will win this war for your kind? Samuel's gaze was cold. I don't need it to, I just need it to win this battle. The door to the chamber hissed open abruptly, and a junior officer stumbled in, his scales paler than they had been moments ago. His breathing was sharp, uneven. He hesitated, eyes flickering between Vorkar and Samuel before speaking. Overseer. His voice was tight with urgency. There is a situation. Vorkar turned on him sharply. What situation? The officer swallowed. A disturbance in the fleet. There have been reports of crew unrest. Some ships have gone to alert status without command authorization. Samuel's smile widened. It was starting. Vorkar's jaw tightened. Who? The officer hesitated. Multiple vessels. They seem to believe the prisoner is not secured. Vorkar's eyes burned with barely contained rage. They are fools. He is right here. The officer looked away. It does not matter what is true, Overseer. It matters what they think is true. Samuel sat back, exhaling slowly. They were breaking faster than he had expected. Vorkar's rage twisted into something quieter, something deadlier. He turned to Samuel, and for the first time, there was something else in his gaze. Not just anger, not just control, recognition. Samuel met his eyes without hesitation. You should have killed me the moment you took me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Because now it's too late. Vorkar exhaled sharply through his nose, turning sharply to his officers. Prepare an execution order. Samuel smiled. Perfect. He had just been given the perfect excuse to escape. The cell was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the ship's energy conduits running through the walls. Samuel sat in the same chair, his wrists still bound, his expression unreadable. Yet beneath the surface, everything was shifting. He had seen the flicker of doubt in their eyes, had heard the waver in their voices. The moment they had spoken his call sign aloud, they had unknowingly given him the first crack in their armor. And now they had made an even bigger mistake. They had decided to execute him. Vorkar's command had been sharp, a desperate grasp for control. A public execution would reaffirm dominance, erase the creeping fear spreading through the fleet. But Samuel knew better. Fear was a fire that did not go out so easily. Even if they paraded his corpse through the halls, they would never be able to silence the lingering questions. And besides, he had no intention of dying. 2 guards entered the cell, their long-barreled plasma rifles pointed at his chest. Selvari, warriors, tall, scaled, trained for war, but not trained for him. One gestured with his rifle. On your feet. Samuel slowly exhaled and complied, standing with measured calm as if he weren't walking to his own execution. They thought he was beaten. That was the second mistake. The moment his boots touched the corridor floor, he took stock of everything. The placement of the guards, the way their fingers hovered over their triggers, the position of the security, cameras lining the walls, their lenses shifting subtly as they tracked his movement. He was being monitored, but that didn't matter. He wasn't planning on running. They marched him through the winding corridors, past towering bulkheads and recessed lighting that cast everything in the sterile glow of an empire built on rigid control. He let himself be moved, let them think they still held command of the situation, and then, as they rounded a sharp corner, his opportunity arrived. A pulse, barely perceptible, but there. The ship's energy flow stuttered, a flicker in the power grid. Samuel's mind processed the anomaly instantly. The fleet's unrest had finally reached the ship's core. Perfect. He moved. Before the guards could react, Samuel twisted, shifting his weight and slamming his shoulder into the closest Selvari's chest. The impact sent the alien staggering, but Samuel was already reaching. His fingers closed around the second guard's rifle, twisting it sharply before the trigger could be pulled. A discharge of plasma seared past his cheek, close enough to feel the heat, but he had already stepped into the blind spot, his movements precise, practiced. He ripped the rifle free. The first guard recovered, lunging, but Samuel was faster. Brutal pivot sent the stock of the weapon crashing into the alien's skull, the crack of impact loud in the enclosed space. Before the body hit the ground, Samuel had already turned, the rifle now aimed squarely at the second guard. For a fraction of a second, The Selvari hesitated. That was all Samuel needed, a single shot. Plasma burned through the air, slamming into the alien's chest. The guard staggered, his armor melting beneath the force of the blast. Silence followed. Samuel exhaled, scanning his surroundings. He had seconds before the security feeds registered the breach. He moved quickly, stripping the guards of their equipment, extra power cells, a combat blade, a data pad. Minimal supplies, but enough. He wasn't just escaping. He was sending a message. Rifle raised, he strode into the corridor with purpose. There was no need for subtlety now. He could already hear the distant wail of security alarms, the telltale hum of shielded bulkheads sealing themselves in response to the threat. They were trying to contain him. They had no idea. The first wave of reinforcements arrived within minutes. 3 Selvari soldiers, moving in practiced formation. Plasma fire erupted down the corridor, but Samuel was already in motion, rolling into cover behind a reinforced column. He returned fire with controlled precision, each shot placed with lethal intent. The first soldier fell instantly, a clean hit to the throat. The second stumbled as a round tore through his shoulder, sending him spinning into the wall. The third hesitated. Samuel did not. A swift movement, a flash of steel, the combat blade buried deep into the soldier's chest. A gurgled hiss, then silence. Samuel withdrew the blade, wiping the blood against his stolen uniform. 3 down, dozens more to go, but numbers didn't matter. The fear was spreading. By the time the second wave arrived, their movements were less sure, their reactions slower. They were no longer hunting a prisoner. They were hunting a ghost. Samuel weaved through the ship's infrastructure, moving like a shadow through the arterial corridors. He was systematic, shutting down energy grids, overriding security panels, using their own systems against them. Every hallway he passed turned into a kill zone, every locked door a trap waiting to be sprung. The Selvari were realizing the truth. They hadn't captured the Grim Reaper. They had unleashed him. Word spread like wildfire. Communication. Channels lit up with conflicting orders. Some commanders wanted the ship locked down entirely. Others argued that sealing the bulkheads would only trap them inside with him. The disarray played into Samuel's hands perfectly. He made his way to the primary command hub, the central nerve of the ship's operations. The door was reinforced, but he had already disabled the security failsafes en route. With a single command input, the locks disengaged and the heavy doors slid open with a low hiss. Inside, several officers turned, their expressions shifting. From confidence to sheer disbelief, Samuel did not give them time to react. The rifle sang, plasma rounds finding their marks. The room descended into chaos, Selvari scrambling for weapons, for cover, for anything that could stop the onslaught. It didn't matter. He moved with surgical precision, cutting through them like a blade through smoke. And then, standing at the far end of the chamber, was Vorkar. The overseer's expression was unreadable, but Samuel could see the tension in his stance, the way his claws flexed at his sides. For all his earlier confidence, there was something else in his eyes now. Understanding. Samuel stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "You thought you could put this fire out," he said, voice steady. "You thought if you killed me, everything would go back to the way it was." Vorkar did not answer. Samuel took another step. "But you were wrong. You let this happen. You let them believe, and now, no matter what you do, the damage is done." Vorkar exhaled slowly. "You are only one man." Samuel tilted his head slightly. "That's what makes it worse, doesn't it?" Vorkar's jaw tightened. The ship shuddered, the deep, unmistakable tremor of external fire striking its hull. Samuel smiled. "You spent all this time looking inward," he said. "You never stopped to check your scanners, did you?" The alarm klaxons blared louder. Vorkar's gaze flickered to the command panel behind him, to the fleet-wide distress signals now lighting up the display. The realization struck him like a hammer. Humanity was already here. Samuel's voice was quiet, deadly. "You lose." The ship shook again, the distant roar of explosions drowning out the last of the silence. The ship was collapsing. Samuel could feel it. Not the tremors from external fire. Those were easy enough to ignore. It was something deeper, something primal. The fabric of the Selvari warship was being torn apart from within. and no amount of their technological superiority could stem the tide. The human fury that had been unleashed in their midst was unstoppable. He didn't look back as the command center erupted into chaos behind him. Vorkar, the overseer, was still standing there, his claws flexing against the control panel in front of him, but it was too late. The Terran fleet was already moving in. The warnings had gone out, the distress calls had been heard, and they were coming. Humanity had arrived. The sounds of distant explosions echoed through the hallways as the first barrage of Terran fire landed. Massive beams of concentrated energy struck the outer hull, shattering shields and tearing into the structure. There was no retreat now. The Selvari warship, once a proud symbol of their might, was doomed. Samuel's focus shifted to the next phase. He didn't have time to savor his success, not when the ship was burning around him. He turned on his heel, moving swiftly through the corridors, heading for the nearest escape route. The Terran extraction team would be coming for him, and he knew that they would need to move fast. Time was no longer on their side. Ahead, another group of Selvari soldiers scrambled to secure a passage. Panic had replaced the quiet confidence that once marked them. They no longer had the luxury of protocol or order. They were reacting, and Samuel knew that in these moments reaction was their weakness. Without a sound, he slid into the shadows, the rifle still in his hands. The Selvari soldiers moved past him, unaware of the predator in their midst. Samuel's fingers tightened around the weapon, and in the blink of an eye he was moving. The first soldier went down silently, a clean shot to the back of the neck. The second followed seconds later, too slow, too panicked to react. Samuel was like a wraith, a ghost in the halls of a dying ship. The chaos was his ally, and every moment of confusion worked in his favor. He took another turn, heading deeper into the heart of the warship. The explosions outside were becoming more frequent now, the ship's core reactors starting to overload, in response to the damage they had sustained. Time was running out. He moved quickly, rounding another corner, only to find himself face to face with a patrol of 4 Selvari soldiers. They froze for just a moment, long enough for Samuel to assess his options. They weren't expecting him to be here. That was a mistake. Samuel's rifle came up, his movements fluid and decisive. 2 soldiers dropped in the span of half a second, plasma rounds tearing through their chests. The third soldier reached for his weapon, but it was too late. Samuel was already in motion, closing the distance with a speed that the Selvari couldn't match. A sharp twist, and the soldier was disarmed, a knee to the chest sending him crashing to the ground. The last soldier attempted to flee, but Samuel was faster. He grabbed the Selvari by the shoulder, twisting it until he heard the satisfying crack of bone. The soldier fell limply to the floor, a soft hiss escaping his lips as his breath left him. It was over in seconds. Samuel exhaled slowly, wiping the blood from his hands. The ship was crumbling, and he had no intention of being. Around when the last of the Selvari realized they were about to be exterminated. He turned on his heel once more, continuing his way toward the extraction point. In the distance, he could hear the hum of Terran ships entering the atmosphere, their sleek forms slicing through the void toward the Selvari vessel. The battle had been decided before they even knew it had begun. Samuel had stirred the hornet's nest, and now humanity was coming to collect. The escape route was close now. He rounded another corner and saw the large blast doors ahead. Beyond those doors, the extraction team would be waiting. They'd been tracking his progress, coordinating his escape since he'd set foot on the Selvari ship. But they hadn't expected him to cause this much damage on his own. They hadn't expected him to tear through the Selvari lines like a storm. Samuel reached the blast doors, activating the override codes on the panel. He felt the familiar twinge of tension as the doors slowly began to part. Seconds. That's all he had before the entire ship went up in flames. As the doors opened, he stepped into the dimly lit hangar where several Terran soldiers stood, weapons raised in anticipation. They looked up as he entered, their eyes sharp, but none of them hesitated. They were human after all, and they recognized one of their own. "Lieutenant Hudson," one of them said, nodding. "We've got your back." Samuel's gaze flicked around the hangar. His team was here. They had arrived. He could see the Terran warships in orbit, The massive assault craft already unleashing dropships and fighter craft to finish what he had started. The Selvari would be wiped out, their fleet shattered, their empire broken. "Good," Samuel said, his voice low, steady. "Let's finish this." The soldiers moved with him, closing ranks, weapons ready. Behind them, the door to the hangar slammed shut and the whine of engines rose in pitch as the Terran extraction team began their work. But there was no relief for Samuel. Not yet. They were not done. The war was not over. He led the way to the nearest dropship, the soldiers following his every movement. There was no time to waste. The Selvari ships might be in disarray, but their resistance was still dangerous. They would come for him, for the Terran fleet, with everything they had left. As they reached the dropship, Samuel took a moment to glance out the hangar bay's viewport. The Selvari warship was burning, its hull cracked open in places, light spilling from its fractured core. The once proud vessel was now little more than a death trap, a graveyard of their hubris. But it wasn't over. Not yet. "Engines online?" the pilot called out, snapping Samuel back to the present. "Ready for extraction." The doors of the dropship closed behind them, and the craft powered up, lifting off into the atmosphere. Below, the Selvari warship began to disintegrate, its once mighty presence now reduced to smoldering ruins. "Hold tight," the pilot warned, as the dropship veered toward the horizon, the ship's thrusters roaring to life. Samuel didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message had already been sent. Humanity was no longer weak, no longer helpless. They were no longer the prey. They were the hunters. As the ship rocketed toward space, Samuel allowed himself a single glance toward the Selvari fleet, a fleet that was already retreating, scattering, in the wake of the destruction they had wrought. The Selvari might have underestimated humanity, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The grim Reaper had come, and humanity's wrath had only just begun.